Pizza time!
Cowabunga!
The Turtles were everywhere in the late 80s. Lunchboxes, action figures, board games, costumes. They were the centre of many kids' dreams and the bane of many parents' lives. With this popularity came video games. Lots and lots of video games. With the speed at which the gaming landscape was changing in the era, the variety of systems and gameplay styles that the TMNT covered was wide-ranging and constantly expanding. Nintendo's release of the Game Boy in the late 80s was a critical moment in the industry, as it opened up high-quality handheld gaming to the masses. The system was cheap, the games were fun, and kids didn't need to hog the TV to play them. In many ways, it was the ideal destination for a franchise like TMNT, whose fanbase matched up perfectly with the Game Boy's intended audience. The humble handheld received a trilogy of Turtles games over its lifespan, all coming via the prolific publishing powerhouse Konami. In this video, we'll take a look at each of these games, both individually and as a collective trilogy, and evaluate how successful Konami was at translating the vibrant soul of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to Nintendo's diminutive machine. Fall of the Foot Clan was released in 1990, around a year after the Game Boy's launch, relatively early in the life of the handheld. Many developers were still getting to grips with the hardware, especially the limited visibility of the small screen. This made conveying the extremely colourful, larger-than-life turtles a real challenge. And yet, Fall of the Foot Clan wasn't just a passable distraction, it was a fully fledged, original title that showed an understanding of the destination hardware well in advance of most third-party developers at the time. The scenario was quite similar to what had been seen before on the NES in the arcade game. April and Splinter are held hostage by the Foot Clan, and it is up to the Turtles to battle their way through New York to face Shredder and rescue them. Cue the theme music. The developers clearly understood what was appealing to kids about the Turtles, and made sure to keep any major impediments to their enjoyment out of the way when designing the game. You pick your turtle of choice, and are immediately thrust into the streets of New York. There are no overworlds here, no RPG elements, just simple, side-scrolling action. The Turtles look different, but there are basically no gameplay differences between them in Fall of the Foot Clan. This does cut down on the depth a bit, but it also allows for kids to play with their favourite turtle without any major disadvantages. It's not like the NES, where if you were a fan of Raph or Mikey, you spent the game feeling like you were a second-class citizen. The action itself is very simple. You can attack with your weapon, do a flying jump kick, or throw shurikens from a crouching stance. Most enemies are easy to take down, and the game feels as much about controlling horizontal space as anything else. Compared with the NES game, there are nowhere near as many platforming or movement challenges, and the game is much simpler as a result. This was likely a deliberate choice made to play to the Game Boy's strengths, but it does mean that the game doesn't really hold up to repeated playthroughs. It's worth at least one though, even if just to experience some of the best early-gen presentation of the Game Boy's entire library. It's amazing to think this came out only a year after launch, as it crushes most other games when it comes to visual identity and complexity. The most obvious strength are the huge sprites, which are nicely detailed without becoming too messy on the small screen. This goes for the standard enemies, bosses, and the turtles themselves. The backgrounds are really well done, with enough white space to accommodate the foreground action without becoming bland themselves. Visually, the game avoids basically all of the traps and pitfalls that lesser developers fell into when creating games for the system. My one gripe visually is fairly subjective. I just don't love how the turtles themselves look in this game. They animate well enough, but there's something about their fighting stance and facial expressions that just look awkward to me. Almost like they're stuck with a crooked smile the entire game. They certainly are more like the cartoon turtles than the darker interpretation from the cover art, but they still don't quite hit properly for me. It's a minor thing that isn't so obvious during the gameplay, but something I can't help but notice. The sound is decent, though not spectacular. As you've heard, the theme song is here and sounds great, but the rest of the music is fairly forgettable. Sound effects are really as you'd expect from an early-gen Game Boy title too. Nothing terrible, but not as memorable as the visuals. The biggest issue with the game is the length. More specifically, the lack of it. The game is a few stages long, each with multiple sections and a boss. They don't take long to get through, and the game isn't particularly challenging. Sitting down to play it for the first time, you'll likely be done with it within an hour. This would have been appropriate back in the day when you were 8 years old, had 20 minutes at a time to play, and were happy to replay the opening stages as many times as it took. But these days, it simply means that the game is over before you've even finished your lunch break. Even so, it's a simple game, and doesn't wear out its welcome before the credits roll. And really, what more could you ask for from an early Game Boy title? All in all, Fall of the Foot Clan is a neat little package, and a great start for the Turtles on Nintendo's handheld. Back from the Sewers was released a year after Fall of the Foot Clan, and featured a raft of improvements. From the gameplay to the presentation, the sequel felt in almost every way like a smoothed out, refined version of the original Game Boy title. This was obvious from the jump, as the introduction remains one of the best on the handheld. What an improvement over the first game! This carries through to the rest of Back from the Sewers. Everything looks and sounds significantly better than Fall of the Foot Clan. Interestingly, it's the audio that's the most obvious improvement. The music has more character than the original game, with the percussion helping to boost the sound from the tiny Game Boy speaker immensely. There's a lot of variety as you move through different locations. The other addition is some fun digitized speech, a rare occurrence on the Game Boy, but certainly a welcome one. Visually, the game looks even better than the already impressive original. The giant sprites return, but with more detail, and an art style that skews even more heavily towards the cartoon. It's interesting to note the change in how everything is shaded. The original game kept the backgrounds quite simple in contrast to the sprites, which made it easy to follow the action on the screen. There is a lot more shading and detail in the backgrounds and general scenery in Back from the Sewers that helps it to feel a lot more like the cartoon, but still without distracting too much from the action. Overall, the presentation is just much stronger here in every way. Even the menus are massively improved. Compare selecting Turtles in the first game with the sequel. So, how do the Turtles themselves look in this one? Well, they're redrawn and more expressive, but I still don't love them. They're more side-on here, and there's just something odd about them. I especially dislike the way the jumping kick looks. So, still the weakest part of the presentation for me personally. Getting back to the good stuff, the gameplay is also expanded upon from Fall of the Foot Clan. The Turtles all now play slightly differently, with their weapons having different properties from one another. It's still not as drastic as the NES game, but an improvement over Fall of the Foot Clan at least. If a turtle is defeated, then they are captured by Shredder and imprisoned under the watchful eye of Rex 1. This leads to a bonus stage where defeating the robot jailer will bring the captured brother back into the fold. In general, the movement feels a lot more dynamic, with the ability to climb on certain structures. The game is still a fairly simple left-to-right affair most of the time, but the additional movement options make the whole thing feel more fluid and interesting, and provide a sense of verticality that was not present in the first game. One big change compared to Fall of the Foot Clan is the difficulty. The first game was a pretty easy affair, which you could charge through fairly mindlessly. Based on the screenshots and some of the initial stages, you'd think the second game would be more of the same. In reality though, there's a huge difficulty spike after a couple of levels, and things get very hairy very quickly. It's actually quite refreshing to play a platformer that doesn't hold your hand and assumes a level of patience in the player. This may not jibe with everyone though. In many ways, Back from the Sewers is a substantial improvement over the first game. It's amazing what a bit more time and experience with the Game Boy hardware allowed developers to achieve. The difficulty may put some players off, but for everyone else, this is a worthwhile addition to your Game Boy library, especially if you're a Turtles fan. The success of the first two Turtles games on the handheld would lead you to expect something similar for the third game. Some refinements in the gameplay, slightly improved presentation, and a Christmas marketing blitz appropriate for its late November release date. And yet, Radical Rescue is completely different to the previous games. In fact, it's an intriguing early glimpse into a genre play that would see Konami through the next 15 years of Castlevania titles. You see, this is a Metroidvania. But before the Vania, Radical Rescue begins with a similar setup to the other Game Boy games, as April is being captured by Shredder. There is a slight catch though. Leo, Raph, and Donnie have also been captured. This means you start the game as Mikey and need to find a way to rescue your brothers as part of the adventure. Hence, the Radical Rescue. The game starts out fairly cheekily, with a simple left to right section that belies the game's true structure. A few minutes in though, and the differences between this game and the previous ones on the handheld become obvious. This is a similar game to Metroid in many ways, with a large map that limits you to specific areas at first, but becomes traversable as you defeat enemies and unlock new abilities. Cleverly, these unlocks are mostly centered around the different turtles and their special techniques. The game opens with Mikey, who is able to hover using his nunchucks like a helicopter blade. Leo has a drill technique that lets him break through the floor in certain areas. Raph can squeeze back into his shell to let him move through tunnels, a bit like the morph ball ability of a certain bounty hunter. Donnie can climb walls, a bit like the team could in the second game, but with more space to play around in. The environment itself is fairly open, with a good deal of backtracking necessary as you unlock turtle abilities in order to access new areas. The map itself is quite interesting, with a lot of verticality and some clever placement of alternative routes. You are guided fairly closely through the game, but the sense of exploration never wanes. One element of frustration lies with the navigation, as it can be a bit hard to remember where you are on the small screen, and it can be very easy to get lost. There is a reasonable amount of visual variety for a Game Boy game, but this is an unusually large map for the handheld, and the limitations of the monochrome screen do hold it back a little. The presentation in general, though, is fantastic. The sprites are huge, again. Background elements are nicely detailed, again. The animation is well done, again. It's clear that Konami knew what they were doing with the graphics for the Trilogy on the Game Boy. The enemies in particular are bursting with character, from the Foot Clan soldiers to the various bosses. Speaking of bosses, it's nice to see some different faces in this game, such as Scratch and Dirtbag. Most importantly, how do the turtles look? Good news, they look fantastic. They've been styled differently in this game, looking more akin to their darker interpretations in the comics and later TV shows than the other handheld titles. They sport a lean, athletic look that suits the more dynamic gameplay in Radical Rescue compared with the previous two. The different weapon attacks and special abilities also help differentiate them from one another, despite the limited colour palette. The music is great too, providing energy and atmosphere in equal measures. Whilst it is still distinctly Turtles-ish, there is a slightly darker tone here, that matches the stylistic change to the visuals. I particularly love the boss battle theme. It brings a sense of urgency and danger to each boss fight, helping to elevate them even further. This is a longer game than the other two, even if you know where you're going and avoid getting lost. It's quite tough too, though the difficulty spike is not as sudden as it was in Back from the Sewers. It features a password system this time, so you can at least come back and keep trying from wherever you left off. Overall, Radical Rescue is an unexpectedly ambitious way to finish the trilogy on the Game Boy. It improves in all of the anticipated ways, but also expands the gameplay to become a much deeper, more complex experience. Radical Rescue truly does feel like a testbed for a lot of ideas that Konami would go on to refine over the next few years, whilst remaining an excellent game in its own right. So, a brilliant swan song for the franchise on Nintendo's legendary handheld. The TMNT games on the Game Boy went from strength to strength with each new game. Fall of the Foot Clan was an impressive debut that deftly avoided the common issues that plagued many early Game Boy titles. Back from the Sewers iterated on the original, providing some of the best presentation on the system. Radical Rescue retained the strengths of the previous two games, whilst experimenting with a gameplay template that they would further refine for the next decade and a half. These were certainly not the last portable Turtles games, as future handhelds like the Game Boy Advance and PlayStation Portable would receive TMNT games several years later. Heck, if you count the Nomad, you also have a bunch more games from the same era as the Game Boy Trilogy you could throw into the mix. Then again, few consoles would ever see so many unique Turtles games. Most future portable games would be multi-platform titles that would be adapted to fit the destination console instead, such as the games based on the 2003 series or the 2007 film. This makes the Game Boy Trilogy an especially nice slice of nostalgia to seek out. Like with all retro games though, be ready to pay some truly exorbitant prices for original cartridges. For those who aren't specifically enamoured with the original hardware, they are all playable on the Cowabunga collection, which is an excellent purchase for any Turtles fan, and one I highly recommend. Finally, for those who haven't worked it out yet, the answer is Donatello. Come on. Are you really surprised?